Welcome back. Today we're continuing with our discussion on the difference between productive and unproductive labor. And today we're going to look at a more systematized notion of this distinction, which is that presented by Marx. And I'm going to argue that it's more scientific, that it includes more caveats, and we're going to look at them. But first, let me point out that the book that we're going to use to guide our discussion today is this one, Measuring the Wealth of Nations by Shaikh and Tonak, in which they do a really good job first at pointing out what exactly is this Marxist conception of the distinction between production and non-production labor, and then using this distinction to build measurements for economic performance in the United States in the post-war period that can be used to study other economies and to look at surplus value at the categories, basically, that are of interest in the classical and in the Marxist tradition. So this is a highly recommendable book, and today is the book that I'm going to use to guide us through this discussion. Now, before beginning with Marx's particular definition, first let's make a little bit of a summary of what happened last video. Now, in the last video, I discussed Adam Smith's particular definition, and we saw that Adam Smith is, on the one hand, interested in the wealth of nations. His book is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, so he's clearly interested, when making this distinction, in the kind of labor that produces wealth and the kind of labor that doesn't produce, that actually consumes wealth, that takes up from this wealth. And on the one hand, he seems to have this definition that productive labor is the labor that produces use values, which are in the end the material basis for any society's wealth, regardless of whether it's a capitalist society or a feudal society. Use values are what constitute the material wealth of all societies, and Marx points that in capitalist societies, wealth is generally visible to us as a mass of commodities, since pretty much all use values, or most use values in capitalist societies, are commodified. They are turned into commodities, right? Because they serve as part of this process of capital accumulation, right? So leaving that aside, so Adam Smith is interested in this, and on the one hand, he seems to introduce this distinction of productive and unproductive labor as production labor being the kind that produces use values. But then we saw this quote where Adam Smith says that a master, grows rich by employing manufacturers, but grows poor by employing menial servants. And the reason for this is because menial servants don't actually produce any tangible physical object that the master can sell at a profit. So this is an important distinction, because now this is not really the same distinction as the first one that we saw, because now we are speaking not about objects of social use, about use values, but we are rather speaking about property in some of these objects, specifically those that are physical, tangible objects, which is something that Marx is also not going to agree with, but we're going to discuss that now. So he's speaking about the property that makes them exchangeable, that actually turns them into other commodities or into money, so that the master can earn a profit. So he's introducing here a different distinction, because now he's pretty much only considering the kind of labor that produces physical things that can be sold at a profit. But not all use values are commodities. All commodities are use values, but not all use values are commodities. So are you speaking about the kind of labor for which there is a market, or are you speaking about the kind of labor that produces use values? Now, this is somewhat of an ambiguity. Marx is going to pick the first definition, the definition of production labor as that which produces use values. Ricardo is also going to pick the first definition, seems to pick the first definition. But Ricardo is also going to agree with Adam Smith on this notion that only physical objects are the tangible physical objects are the ones that count, as these use values, as constituting wealth. Whereas Marx is going to be critical with this notion, because he's going to define use values in a different way that encompasses a lot of what we could consider, production activities, that we could consider, for example, services as production activities, services that would not be considered as production activities within the classical tradition because they don't directly produce any tangible thing. A singer, for example, in the classical tradition would not be considered as a production laborer, but in the Marxist tradition it can actually become a production laborer if they perform a concert, for example. So now that we've seen a little bit about this ambiguity in Adam Smith's definition and we've summarized what we saw last time, now let's get to the important part, which is Marx's particular conception. So first, let's note that Marx makes a distinction between 4 different kinds of activities, the basic activities of social reproduction. And these activities are basically 3 activities that constitute labor and 1 activity that doesn't constitute labor. So let's start with the activity that does not constitute labor, which is personal consumption. Now, it is very clear that when you are consuming use values, you're not directly producing any use values themselves. You're just consuming them personally, and they're used up, nothing else is created, right? This is a distinction that also neoclassical economics makes, as we already saw, between personal consumption and production. But now, within the kind of activities that constitute labor, now we're actually going to make a distinction. Marx is going to make a distinction between productive and unproductive labor, which is something that the neoclassical tradition doesn't really make, because for them all activities that have a market to them are actually production activities. Now, within the labor activities, Marx is going to say that one is going to constitute, as you can see in this chart that is taken from the book, you can see that Marx is going to consider only one type of labor, production labor, and he's going to consider the 2 other types of labor as non-production labor. So first, let's start with production labor before we go to the other 2 forms, and let's focus a little bit on what exactly this production is. How do we define production labor? So production labor for Marx is the process by which use values are used up, productively used up, in the formation or transformation of new use values, or in the transformation of existing use values. So this seems a simple distinction at first, a simple definition at first, because it's pointing to the fact that there are use values that are used up in the production of new use values, or in the transformation of the already existing use values. So there is new wealth being created. Now, this seems simple at first, but it is actually a little bit more complex, because how exactly do we define use values? How exactly do we define what we could also consider objects of social use? So here it is important to keep in mind that in a Marxist tradition, when we speak of use value, we could be speaking of one of 2 things. First, we would be speaking of the physical, the actual properties of a given object of social use that turn them into that object of social use. So these classes, for example, we could consider these classes as a use value, because they have a set of properties that turn them into an object that is useful, into an object of social use. But we could also be speaking in a more colloquial manner, we could also be speaking, when we say use value, about the property of satisfaction of human needs or human wants that particular object of social use has. So this could be a perceived use value, it could be a perceived utility. Before exchange, I perceive that whatever commodity I'm going to gain from that exchange is going to have a use value, is going to satisfy some want, and we could also refer to that, which is more subjective, whereas the objective properties of the use value are objective. The satisfaction that I obtain from the use of that particular object of social use is subjective. And here there's also a distinction between the perceived use value that I perceive before the exchange, and the one that I actually gain, the satisfaction that I gain once I'm consuming the commodity or the use value after exchange has occurred. So what matters really for directly matters for exchange is the use value that I perceive I will obtain from the consumption of the commodity that I'm willing to trade something for. Marx says in volume 1 of Das Kapital that the producer of commodity A doesn't find direct use value in that particular commodity A, so they since they don't find direct use value, they exchange it in the market for commodity B, for which they do find use value. And now, after that exchange is occurred, if the producer of commodity B also finds use value in commodity A, that there's going to be a gain in utility after that process has occurred. So since we're speaking about these two different definitions, the definition that really matters for this discussion of productive and unproductive labor is really the one that refers to the objective properties that turn the objects of social use into useful objects, right? So when we speak of use values in plural, we are normally referring to the objects that are themselves the material basis for the wealth of any society. So now that we know this, what exactly is an object of social use? What exactly is a use value? Well, Marx defines an object of social use as a particular material thing or effect, right? So since we are saying thing or effect, we are not limiting ourselves to actual tangible material things, which is what Adam Smith and David Ricardo were limiting themselves to. When we speak of effect, we could be speaking of services that could also be considered as production activities, because Marx is going to want to encompass more things, because he's not going to be as simplistic as economists before him had been, right? So under this definition, transportation activities, transportation labor, could be actually considered as production labor, because it is enhancing the objective properties of a particular object so as to make them useful, right? So let's take, for example, I'm a producer of wine in a particular region of Spain, and I sell the wine in Madrid. So the wine that I produce in that particular region of Spain, if it stays there, it doesn't find any market because no one is going to buy it there, and it's not really going to be an object of social use unless the process is completed by changing the property of its location. So since its location matters as far as the useful properties of that particular wine are concerned, when we transport the wine from that region to Madrid so that it can be sold to the consumer, we are actually transforming that commodity so that it now has the property of being in the location where it is useful for that particular for the particular consumer of that wine. So we are in fact producing the act of the wine being at the disposal of the consumer. So we are actually considering transportation as potentially a production activity. Now, transportation can also be considered as distributive, which is non-production labor, as we're now going to see. But that requires a little bit more of explanation, which we're going to see later. So now we can see that a barber, for example, someone that cuts your hair, is actually also a productive labor, because they are creating a material effect. They are producing actually a haircut that it's actually pretty physical, right? You can touch the haircut, you can look at its shape. If they put some kind of perfume or something, you can smell it, and many other things. So it is actually an object of social use. So haircuts, for example, could also be barbers could also be considered as productive laborers. So now you can see that within production we are encompassing things that we could consider to be services, and that actually are services, but that in other more simplistic notions would not be considered as production activities. So now that we know what production is, which again, to put it again in these terms, is the formation or transformation of objects of social use, now that we know what production is, now we need to look at what production is not. So what are the forms of labor that are not productive? So as you can see in this chart, we see that there are three types of labor, and two types that are non-production labor. So what is the first type of non-production labor? It is distribution labor. So distribution is the process by which there is a transfer of the commodity from the immediate of a commodity or an object of social use from the immediate possessor of that object of social use to the person that is going to be using it, right? So there is a transfer of ownership, right? So distribution, as you can see, it does not add up to wealth because it is distributing the existing wealth, and in any case, it's actually consuming some part of that wealth because a lot of the people that are engaged in production labor also need to exist. In non-production labor, in distributed labor, also need to exist. So you can see, to introduce a caveat, that actually distribution labor does in fact transform the use values that it transfers because it's changing the property, the ownership over those use values. So it's transforming those use values in a sense. So maybe one could argue that you could consider them as production activities, distribution activities. You could consider them as production activities, but in reality, this is not the case because distribution activities, whereas it is in fact the case that they are transforming the use values that they transfer, they are only transforming them insofar as their properties as objects of possession are concerned. But what matters for an object of social use is their properties as objects of social use. So that property is not really being transformed. So the object is still the same thing, only that now the possession over that object is a different one. So there's no wealth being created, there's just a transfer of that wealth. And if anything, there's actually wealth being detracted because you need to pay the people that are employed in this kind of labor. So what am I talking about? For example, imagine you go to a fisherman, right? And that fisherman has caught some fish, and they're in the market. They are selling that fish that they have caught, and because they have a lot of fish, they have a lot of clients. They don't have enough time, they don't have the capacity to be, to attend every single client that wants to sell, that wants to purchase their fish. So they hire someone that is there to, take note of the client's desires, and they say, okay, what do you want exactly? You want a kilogram of this particular fish? Okay, so then they take it and they transfer the ownership over that fish from the one that immediately possesses it, which is the fisherman, to the consumer, and in exchange they obviously get some money, right? So this person that would be a cashier, you could consider them as a cashier, is actually engaging in distribution labor, and the fisherman actually has to pay some of the revenue, right, to that particular cashier. So you can see that it's actually a costly activity, but it's not adding new fish, right? So that person is just transferring the fish from the owner to the consumer and getting, the money in exchange. So there's no new production being done. It is rather a transfer over the ownership of that particular fish. So since distribution is a non-production activity, what else does not count as production labor? And this is the kind of labor that is employed in the reproduction of a given set of social conditions. So as you can see in the chart, it is this social maintenance, this social reproduction labor. So this kind of labor would be the one done, for example, by policemen, by the military, by judges, for example, right? They are there to reproduce a given set of social relations, a given set of social conditions, and obviously as they do their job, they need to get paid in some form or another. They need to exist, they need to eat food. So there is a deduction of wealth that goes into into paying them, right? So they are not producing anything actually, right? When the military is at war, they are, if anything, they're actually consuming or destroying wealth, right? They are destroying buildings, they are destroying roads, They are using up food, armor, weaponry, and many other things. So it's actually a non-production activity. And given that it is not a non-production activity, we would categorize it as non-production labor. But now we need to notice that now that we've seen, these three types of labor, personal consumption is not a form of labor, so it's not even productive labor because it's not even labor. So now that we know these types of labor that exist, and that now that we know that one is production and the other two are non-production labor, now we need to look at a really, really, really important point that is going to help us understand further points that we are going to be making in this series relating to surplus value, the theory of exploitation, value, and many other things. So, as you can see, these categories are quite general, so you can actually use them to study the kind of social activities that go on in other societies that are non-capitalistic, that are not capitalist societies. You can use these categories to analyze feudal societies, slave-based societies, because all societies need to produce use values, all societies need to distribute use values, all societies need to have a set of people employed in the reproduction of the set of conditions of relations that characterize those societies. So given that these are general categories, we can also distinguish between the kind of outcomes that are, in a sense that when you employ that labor that you are seeking, so the kind of outcomes that would be desired from the employment of that particular labor, whether it's productive and non-productive labor. And here we can distinguish between three different kinds of purposes, of the three different kinds of motivations that would lead a society to have that kind of labor. So on the one hand, we have production for direct use. And this is a very easy thing to see. So you can use production labor for direct use. I can produce, as the example that I've used already, a ham sandwich and eat it myself. I'm not producing it to sell it for an income. I'm not producing it as part of a capitalistic production process. I am producing it for direct use. You could also engage in non-production labor, in distribution or social maintenance labor for direct use as well. But you can also employ production labor, distribution labor, or social maintenance labor, as you can see in this chart, also taken from the book, for income, so sell for income, right? It is easy to see that in a kind of society, or where capitalist production is not developed, or even in capitalist societies, a self-employed person, for example, a person that let's say owns a pizza shop, and they are the only one producing the pizza over there, and they don't have anyone else employed, so they themselves produce the pizza and they sell it. Their income is going to be the pizza that they sell. So they are producing for income. You can see that this is not the same as we're going to see as producing for profit, because producing for profit involves another set of relations. And the same way you can also produce for income when it comes to non-production activities. So you can also engage yourself in non-production labor for income. And this is the most important distinction of the three for our purposes studying capitalist societies, which is production for profit. Now, production for profit involves the set of social relations that we've already seen in our video of speaking about capital, about the different forms of capital, about the process of capital. Now this, when you produce for profit, you are assuming these kinds of relations. And what you are assuming is that there is a surplus that has been created over and above what the costs to the capitalist are. So you have an owner of means of production, you have a set of laborers, you have means of production, the active ingredient in production is labor, and you see that there is an advancement of the wages and of the purchase of those particular raw materials and of the means of production, and the advancement of these wages is in the form of variable capital of constant capital in the case of the means of production and of the raw materials. And you can see that after the production process has occurred, a new set of commodities emerges from that process that is then sold at a profit. So the commodities there has been an increase in wealth, which constitutes what we could consider as surplus value. So you can see that only production labor that is employed for profit is that which produces surplus value. So production for income produces value, right? Because commodities produced for income still exchange against one another according to their values, or in a more complex manner, they are regulated by their values. And when you produce for profit, there is this surplus value. So then, what is the definition of the kind of labor that is productive of capital? What is exactly the definition of the kind of labor that is actually the one that is subject to exploitation, defined as surplus value? Well, it is clearly production labor, and those laborers have first their wages advanced as variable capital, and then it is labor that produces a set of use values, or transforms a set of use values so that they can be sold at a profit. So this is surplus value. But whereas if we define exploitation only as surplus value, this would be the only form of exploitation existing in capitalist societies, it is clearly the case that there could also be non-productive labor capitalistically employed. This is an example that I've given in the past, but I think it's important to give it here again. I could be, for example, a businessman that owns a private military company. So I own a set of a militia that is formed by mercenaries that sell their labor as private military to, well, let's say individuals, or to governments, or to other organizations. And I, as the businessman that owns this corporation that sells military services, I obviously want to earn a profit. So I use these laborers in a non-production activity, which is military activity of war, of defense, or many other things that constitute non-production labor, in the sense of they are employing themselves in socially in labor that goes towards social reproduction, of social maintenance. And I could still earn a profit because I sell those services of my employees, which are the military, the different people that fight in the wars, and so on and so forth. And I earn a profit from that because I pay less than what the governments, or the individuals, or the organizations pay me. So I'm clearly earning a profit, but that profit is not based on a production process where there has been an addition of wealth, right? It is based on the fact that from the wealth that other people have, that they have given me, I have paid my consumer, the particular people that work within my non-productive company. I have paid them less than what I've actually received in the form of the wealth that those people have given me. So here you can see that this would actually constitute a form of exploitation, but it is not the same as surplus value. It could be considered, for example, surplus labor, in the sense of these people have had to work more than they would have needed to work if I wasn't the capitalist, if I wasn't the owner and I had to take part of that income that has been received from whatever the organizations, or the countries, or the individuals have paid me for those services. So here you can see that it is still exploitation, but it is not surplus value. So this is important because normally when we speak of exploitation, we only refer to surplus value, or we mainly refer to surplus value, but there are other forms of non-production activity that can also lead to a kind of exploitation, which is important because, there's normally a conflation between these different categories in the literature and in online discourse. So it's important to keep these definitions in mind and this distinction in mind because, you don't want to fall into these kinds of traps where you don't really know how to define certain things properly. So having noted all of this, we can now move towards a discussion of the interactions between the different these different forms of labor, between the different sectors of the economy, the ones that are employed in production and non-production labor, the transfer of the total wealth created in a given year by an economy between these different sectors, what are the implications for the rate of profit, what are the implications for capital accumulation. And now that we already have built this strong foundation, we can get to really important stuff that will explain a lot of the things relating to we've already hinted at things relating exploitation, but we will also look at the business cycle, the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and many other things that cannot be properly understood if you don't really have these bases. So this is a really crucial topic, and I hope you got vital information from these two videos that I made on this topic, and I hope that you really understand this issue. If you want to get a good grasp at the kind of things that we're going to be speaking about in this series, and if you really want to get a good grasp at an understanding of economics that is more scientific and that is based on the principles of the classical economists, which were looking at capitalism, with a truly scientific lens, wanting to understand how things worked in capitalist societies, not in some ideal world of perfection or in some world of imperfection, right? So having noted all of this, I'm going to end it here. If you have any comments, any suggestions, any questions, you can always ask me in the comment section. And as I normally say, you can support me by you can support this channel by liking, by subscribing. It's really important if you enjoy this content that you subscribe and you comment, and we create here a community of people interested in these topics so that we can discuss amongst each other these issues. And having noted all of this, I hope you enjoy this content, and I will see you in the next video.